Thanks for having me. I've just drove down this morning from the murky Midlands to the sunny southwest. This seems like a pretty good place to spend your time at university to me, just from first impressions. I've visited Exeter city centre a couple of times, where I've never been to the university before, but you're very fortunate, I think, to have a berth here at Exeter, and I really do hope that you're taking full advantage of it. The beaches are how far away, guys? Are you denying knowledge of that? Yeah? Look, I've been asked to try to give you an insight into decision making in government, and I will certainly do my level best, to do that. And I will try to concentrate on how ministers work as much as I can, but in order to set that into context, let me just first of all say one or two things about how the circumstances in which people become ministers, because I don't know how familiar you are with the political system. Fundamentally and overwhelmingly, there are two circumstances in which people become ministers. One is you win a general election and an entire new team takes over, as happened in 2010. Labour lost, the Conservatives didn't win, a coalition was formed, and the spoils of that victory were divvied out, and people were appointed across the piece. So an entire new team effectively took over in government. And there are kind of obvious advantages and disadvantages to that. Overwhelmingly in those circumstances, people have had the time to do the preparation, because they have spent a period in opposition thinking about what they would like to do in government and having the time to do so. And there is a lot more potentially freedom of action, because it is not your record that you are defending. It's not your agenda that you are inheriting. And so the opportunity for a period of time, in any case, in a democracy, is there to make some radical change. The downside to those circumstances is that overwhelmingly, if not completely, the ministerial teams have no experience of government. And so this, walking into departments and being expected to take decisions in often very complex circumstances is pretty challenging. The alternative way that you find yourself in government is after reshuffles, which happen constantly, far too often. In politics, in modern societies, in Britain, most certainly, we feel the need repeatedly just to refresh ourselves, to represent ourselves. And so prime ministers wind up shuffling the pack and moving people around in order to make their governments look new, or in order to be able to give a new emphasis to a particular part of government. That means that ministers don't spend, in my opinion, nearly the amount of time that they ought to do in order to make a very real contribution to the complicated areas of work that they're often dealing with. But it happens, and it happens all of the time. Now, the downside of becoming a minister during a reshuffle as against a general election is that you're inheriting your own agenda. Your room for manoeuvre is therefore a lot more limited. You have to justify. You were a supporter of this government. You were part of the team that got you to where you need to be. There is less room for manoeuvre. You have had less time to think. Government is absolutely crazy in terms of activity level. People are fairly disparaging of politics and politicians, and I understand that, and I get it all the time, from family, never mind, constituents. So I know what people think about politicians, but people who are in ministerial office work ridiculously, extraordinarily lengthy hours. The time to think is non-existent. So your chance to refresh is far more limited. The advantages are that, generally speaking, you don't change your whole team, and that even new ministers moving into departments have previous experience of government, and therefore you've got a more experienced team. That is the circumstance in which I walked into the MOD. The other thing that I just wanted to try to give you an insight into is the degree to which some departments in government are not mainstream to our political thinking. And this is something that drives, for instance, our military round the bend. That the MOD is not part of the mainstream of our political thinking. And why on earth, and a soldier doesn't understand this, and why should he? The first responsibility of government is to defend the nation and the people, surely. Any politician will say that. So why isn't the MOD the most important, most mainstream, most thought about department in government? It's understandable in a way, because there isn't the degree of political divide about defence issues than there is about some other issues. And therefore, for example, education is constantly at the centre of politics and at the centre of Parliament and what's going on in Parliament and what politicians are thinking about and arguing about. Why? Because Conservatives and Labour and other parties have very different views about the funding, the structure, the purpose of education. Health, likewise. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I believe in a far more extensive and universal health coverage than a Conservative would, who believes a little more in self-reliance. There are sharp political differences that run through those departments. In defence, we fall out about things. Generally speaking, we don't fall out about things across party lines, and so therefore there isn't that political divide. And that inevitably means that MOD is not at the centre of our politics. Now, one of the strange consequences of that is that overwhelmingly, when people become defence ministers, no matter how experienced they are, their experience of defence is limited. Our armed forces are a lot smaller than they were, so people who have actually served in the Navy, the Army or the Air Force are far fewer than they once were. But we haven't been thinking about these things. My personal experience, I was, when I walked into the MOD in 2007, probably arguably one of the most experienced ministers in the Labour administration. I had spent the entirety of 10 years in government, either as a whip or as a minister. I'd been in the Home Office doing security-related issues, organised crime and drugs. And yet, despite all of their experience, despite knowing defence ministers personally, and therefore having been privy to a lot of evening chats about issues and Iraq and all kinds of different controversies, when you walk in, you really are confronted by a very complex set of problems in an enormous department of state, an unusual department of state because it is not a simple department of state like others are. It is also a joint military headquarters as well, with a big military contingent in there, you are on a steep learning curve, even with experience. And your ability to make a contribution for a period of time is limited. Now, as General Paul said, I was a minister during an extremely difficult time. When I walked into the MOD, we had 12,000 troops deployed in active operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq was enormously controversial. It was running down, but there were still 4,000 there. Afghanistan was getting bigger. And although I don't think we realised it at all at the time, we were enormously challenged in regards of how much we'd bitten off in Afghanistan. And understandably, those two hugely complex, difficult, controversial, particularly Iraq at the time, operations were dominating a lot of the intellectual power of the department. And yet, there were so many other things that had to be grappled with. We hadn't had a strategic defence review in 10 years. The budget was massively challenged. And the department was, and understandably, I think, under stress. 12,000, to keep 12,000 troops deployed in operations with an army of 100,000 overall, or thereabouts in broad numbers, means that you are working people very, very hard. You're running hot. People are constantly either just come back from operations, they're in pre-deployment training, or they're out in theatre. A very high proportion, of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. And yet there are so many other things that are going on, and the tensions between different branches of the military are beginning to be very stretched as well, because the budget is so difficult. And so you've got a Navy that has worldwide responsibilities dictated in the Strategic Defence Review that your own government agreed to. And yet, the amount of money that's actually been spent on maintenance of ships and shipping and capability has been stretched quite considerably over a period of time. And meeting all those obligations has become steadily more and more challenging. You've got an army, as I've said, that's running hot, as very controversially one of the then Chief of the General Staff told the newspapers, which was made interesting issues arise. A budget that is running away with you, and you've got a new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who hasn't been elected, who is anxious to go to the country and get a mandate, and so therefore doesn't want you to take enormously controversial decisions. A very tense period, and tense within the military as well as within the body politic. The other thing that I just wanted to try to impress upon you, and I think this is bigger than just government. This is something that's about how many of you are Brits here and how many of you are not. How many Brits have we got? Most of you, yeah? I mean, we are what we are, aren't we? We have national characteristics, and I think, different nations have slightly different cultures and the rest of it. We are sometimes a little stiff, sometimes a little formal, sometimes not as forthcoming as as we can be, and that culture comes into government. And therefore some of the structures that we set up and your ability to grapple with decisions can become over-formalised, enormously lengthy, very frustrating, yeah? And all you want to do is take the decision, and you've got this awful structure that you are supposed to take the decision through. Tony Blair used to get hugely criticised in the newspapers for doing sofa government. He didn't have, and I don't think that any Prime Minister is ever going to have again, 2 or 3 hour cabinet meetings where you plough through a long agenda. Life isn't like that anymore. At least Blair consulted people, although he did it in a far more informal way. And so you'll find ministers who are massively taxed with their time, trying to deal with the complexity of government, under huge pressure to take decisions and be seen to be taking decisions, sometimes riding out of and superseding and trying to cut through the formality of government systems, methodology. That can be dangerous because you can miss out on some of the expertise that you really should have listened to. But equally, it's a fact of life, and you have to do it. So those are some of the kind of tensions. We had a crazy structure, I thought, in the MOD, which I flagged up in the green paper that we did when I was Secretary of State, which the Conservative-led government has made some changes to, and I don't know how those changes are working. I hope, that they are working. We had a defence board that met every Thursday, but there were no ministers on it. It leaked to the newspapers on a regular basis. I used to find out what had happened down the corridor because somebody from the Sunday Telegraph would ring my special advisor and tell me. And then we had a defence ministerial board where we tried to co-opt some expertise from outside expertise to help us, and it all became dreadfully stiff. Most of the decision making, therefore, winds up being taken in an ad hoc way. You get the expertise in that you need in order to tackle a decision. Let me give you a couple of examples just to try to give you a bit of background into the kind of decisions and the way they're taken, which are quite surprising. I mean, they amuse me to this day, how we take decisions in government. One example that I thought of that I would share with you is the piracy problem off the east coast of Africa. Somalia has been a dreadful mess for 2 generations and more. And a few years ago, the chaos drifted out onto the ocean. It's better now, a lot better now. And because these people were desperate, because there was no government, this is a completely unruled space, because their fishing livelihoods had been depleted, human beings are fairly inventive, and piracy became a pretty good way of making money, and this was really damaging world trade, shipping, a massive problem. Ships being held, their crews being captive, threatened with their lives, and people winding up diverting all the way around the African continent rather than go through the Straits of Aden and the Red Sea. The way you would have thought that decision would be taken in a pretty structured way. Is the British government going to get involved in this? How are they going to do it? Let's have all the relevant people here. let's talk about what's possible, let's take this to an international body, the United Nations or NATO or whatever have you, and then let's take a decision as to whether or not we try to tackle the problem of piracy. It didn't quite get taken that way. Unbeknownst to me, and I was the Armed Forces Minister at the time, a conversation took place between the French President and the British Prime Minister, and the French President managed to persuade the British Prime Minister that this was an operation that Britain really could and ought to lead. And Gordon Brown agreed to that. There was a desire on his part, I think, to be seen to be cooperative within Europe. We were refusing to join the euro, for heaven's sake. We were doing all kinds of things to upset our European partners. Why on earth not do something positive as well? And if the French president thought this was important, and yes it was, and we were getting a lot of flack from the shipping industry too, why not get involved? So the decision in principle winds up being taken outside of the MOD structure at a very high level between two nations, both of whom have the capability of doing something about this, and two heads of government effectively agreeing. And the Royal Navy, of course, who, despite the fact that they're stretched to high heaven, that their budgets are pretty depleted and that they have got tasks in various parts of the world that they're supposed to carry out, they are up for this. They think this is what the Navy does, isn't it? We chase pirates around the world, we sort out problems, we do wonderful things, yeah? And so they want to do it. And you, as a minister, wind up with this problem because your boss has said yes, your First Sea Lord is yeah. This is something we'll do, this is good for the Navy, this raises our profile, this is what sailors want to do, and it is really, really worthwhile. And it is you and other people in the MOD, these people who are often accused of being donkeys and holding, the lions back from doing their job, who are left trying to think through the potential problems, the potential consequences. What are you going to do when you come across a pirate ship out at sea in the ocean with a great big gun on the front of it and you have a bigger gun on a warship? Are you going to open fire and blow them out the water? Are you allowed to do that? Is it against international law if they don't actually threaten you? Well, yes, it is. Are you going to capture them? If you capture them, what are you going to do with them? You're going to bring them back to England? People were paying about £10,000 to organised criminals at the time to ferry them out of Africa, asylum seekers. Do we want to make the British Navy a nice taxi service for asylum seekers that bring them back to Portsmouth, where our courts can't cope with crimes that supposedly were committed and are practically unprovable halfway around the world? Yeah? What's going to be the huge damage to that? Are you simply going to let them go? How is this going to play in the public arena if you're catching people in pirate skiffs who were trying to capture boats, ships, and hold them to ransom, and then you simply disarm them and let them go? None of this thought about. And this is what you have to try to say then to the Navy: no, you're not doing this until I have some answers to some of these questions, until we've thought through exactly how we're going to deal with these people. What are the rules of engagement? When are we going to fire on them? When are we going to kill people on the high seas? In what circumstances are we going to do this? Yeah? What are we going to do when we capture people? How are we going to prosecute their crimes? Is it practical? Can we actually do this? And that leads to some pretty tense conversations, sometimes with maybe senior naval officers looking at a politician who they don't think really ought to be poking his nose into these affairs, who's never been a sailor, yeah? And your boss has agreed to this. Get out of my way. Stop mucking about. Let's get on. There's a huge problem with piracy. Let's go and do it. But eventually, and if you're strong enough, you wind up with some understanding that this is doable. It is doable in certain circumstances. It might not look like it was originally envisaged. And indeed, what the British Navy-led expedition led to wasn't arresting pirates on the high seas in a fairly gung-ho way, but it was brigading ships, it was offering advice, it was putting them into recognisable and to a degree protectable sea lanes, it was advising them about speeds, about heights of decks, about how they stopped people from being able to climb on the decks of these ships, and setting up an entire system, a monitoring system and a brigading system for shipping in that part of the world, which really did help after a shaky start. But it did have to be thought through. How are we doing for time? So I want to leave you time for questions if I can. One other kind of area that I just wanted to talk on, having given you a kind of maybe insight into a specific decision-making area, is a rather more strategic decision-making area. Having been Armed Forces Minister for 2 years and therefore being reasonably experienced within the department and knowing the issues, I became, with 1 year before the general election, the Secretary of State for Defence. It was a hugely difficult time. The operation in Afghanistan by then had become pretty bloody, and we were losing a lot of people in the Babaji operation, which had been approved by my predecessor, and the budget was a mess. And I had little illusion that we were going to win the next election. I thought that we were on a hide into nothing, This was the last year of our government. Where are your responsibilities in those circumstances? I'm a party politician. I don't like Tories. But the defence of the realm is bigger than party politics, isn't it? And so therefore, what should you do in those circumstances? One is you've got to try to prepare for some of the inevitably hugely difficult decisions that are going to have to be taken the other side of an election. And we knew, because the economy had been massively damaged by the banking crisis in 2008, that was beginning to bite really, really badly, that the decisions that were going to be forced upon the MOD on defence were going to be hugely problematic. How do you deal with that? And you're trying to deal with that when some of your colleagues are not in the same frame of mind as you are. Not everybody in the Labour Party thought that we were going to lose. Many people wanted to, why on earth should we be cooperating with the opposition in any way, in any shape, in the year before an election, when they behave so badly, don't they? You've got to try to steer the situation through so that you do things that are acceptable, that you can get away with, that you can sell to your own Prime Minister, that you can, there are defensible by him, and yet start to do the preparation that will enable a potential new team to deal with a massive problem. And you've got to deal with the complexities of the department as well, because the civil service huge cutbacks in the civil service that we had imposed. Massive workloads, redundancy programs, not exactly the highest of morale among your expertise. There is there to serve you and to help you. And the military budgets stretched to high heaven, and therefore extremely anxious about what was going to happen to them and to their individual services. Remember, an army officer, he has an allegiance to democracy and the democratic process and the government of the day, but his career depends upon the army. You know, he is only going to become, a 2-star general or a 3-star general, with the support of his own service. And so there is inter-service rivalry and tension, within that. I set up in that last year because we had the fortunate side of things is we had 3 new heads of service. All of them changed at about the same time. RAF, Navy, and the Army. New Chief of the General Staff, new First Sea Lord, new Chief of Air Staff. And so there was an opportunity to try to get rid of at least some of this tension and to try to get people into more of a collegiate team operating way. And by organising away days where we got all of the important people together, by being pragmatic about what was achievable, by not pretending that you could do things that you couldn't do. Let's have, within this 11-month time frame between now and next May, when the election is going to be, some practical things that we ought to be doing. What? In terms of the budget. We've got the Treasury going bonkers about us. We want cuts and we want them now. The economy is in difficulty. What cuts outside of a defence review are acceptable? If you don't get people in a room and sit them there and keep them there and talk to them honestly about the situation and give them an opportunity to tell you what the problems are, you're not going to get any agreement at all. But by organising, a structure of away days, we made some cuts to the budget. We did a green paper, which I think enabled the department to start thinking about the bigger picture that was about to be imposed upon them. What's really important to the defence of Britain that we have to hang on to? What's less important? Where are we going to have to give? Yeah? All of those things had to be dealt with. And we had to try, to the degree was possible within this enormously constrained financial situation, to get more assistance to the operation in Afghanistan, which was stretched to high heaven. I mean, we had 8,000 people at one stage covering an area which we do this to the Welsh all the time, the size of Wales. Covering, how on earth do you police an area almost the size of Wales, with 8,000 people? So we managed to get, to a degree, troop density up by an influx of Americans, by handing over some areas of responsibility to the Americans, getting out of some parts of the area of operation, but putting a few more, those that we could, more troops into that shrunken area. And those decisions won broadly cross-party support, and therefore, to my mind, were even good for the Labour Party as well, because they diffused, to a degree, the politics of defence and the Afghan operation.